Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving deep into the mind of visionary author Philip K. Dick. We're going to explore how he channeled his incredibly personal and often very painful mental health struggles into some of the most groundbreaking science fiction ever written. As you'll see, the lines between the creator, his clinical diagnoses, and his fictional realities completely blur in his work. It is absolutely fascinating. To ground us, let's start with this really poignant quote by Franz Kafka. It perfectly sets the stage for what is a difficult but honestly absolutely necessary exploration of psychological disorders. Mental illness is a topic that is way too often treated as a cultural taboo. It just arrives without warning, and as Kafka points out here, none of us are ever truly prepared for it. So I want you to ask yourself, what happens when a writer's own mental battles become the actual forge for their fictional realities? Philip K. Dick didn't just write about imaginary futures, right? He used his sci-fi worlds as a tool to force us to confront the very psychological subjects we would much rather avoid in our daily lives. Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. We're going to hit 6 main stops: breaking the mental health taboo, agoraphobia and the safe zone, schizophrenia and collapsing reality, paranoia in a watched world, autism and society's patterns, and finally, confronting reality in treatment. Let's get right into it.
First up, breaking the mental health taboo.
A fundamental truth about Dick's work is that he intentionally ripped away the secrecies surrounding mental illness. Instead of hiding from these issues, he threw them right in your face. He integrated exact medical definitions, specific drug names, and intensely real hospital experiences right into the pages of his stories. He forces his readers to pay attention. You literally can't read his work without actively learning about the very conditions society tries so hard to sweep under the rug. Moving right along to part 2, agoraphobia and the safe zone. Now, this was an anxiety illness Dick personally wrestled with early in his life. Clinically, agoraphobia is often misunderstood, right? People think it's just a fear of open spaces. But actually, scratch that, it's really characterized by a severe terror of public spaces where help isn't readily available. Agoraphobes experience severe, debilitating panic attacks if they feel inadequately protected, or if they're separated too far from what they designate as their personal safe zone. Dick's own battle with this disorder peaked when he was really young, between 1944 and 1946. And it was so severe that it actually resulted in a stay at a psychiatric hospital for intensive treatment by 1947. So when he writes about this stuff, this wasn't abstract research for him. This was a lived, paralyzing fear. Through characters like Stewart in his novel Dr. Blood Money, Dick vividly channels his own observations of psychiatric patients. This quote is just haunting. It perfectly captures the sheer terror of losing control, that awful feeling of being eaten up by something slow and unstoppable. It's a direct, unfiltered window into the despair he witnessed in the wards. All right, on to part 3, schizophrenia and collapsing reality. This was the second profound mental illness that intervened in his life and heavily influenced his novels. Schizophrenia severely impairs a person's ability to sense and respond to emotions. It often leads to deep social dysfunction, auditory hallucinations, and a total failure of logical thought processes. It basically creates a terrifying disconnect from our shared human experience. And Dick didn't just casually slap these labels on his characters. In the book We Can Build You, he meticulously documents the main character Louis Rosen's struggle with schizophrenia. He outlines the absolute dark depths of the disease, the critical necessity for outside help, and paints a really stark, unflinching picture of contemporary American hospitalization. Dick had this incredibly unique way of translating the clinical prognosis of a broken reality into a visceral, genuinely terrifying experience for the reader. Like in Martian Timeslip, he explains that a schizophrenic vision actively destroys a person's relationship with others. It effectively severs their contact with reality entirely. Once you've seen that collapse, as he says, you can never forget it. That brings us to part 4, paranoia in a watched world. Paranoia is a theme that is absolutely central to almost all of Dick's dystopian landscapes. And no surprise, it was a very real part of his own life, too. Dick personally believed paranoia wasn't just some chemical imbalance. He actually viewed it as an evolutionary atavism. He described it as an ancient prey animal's instinctual feeling of being watched by a predator. And he projected this ancient survival mechanism right onto the modern citizens of his futuristic worlds. His personal paranoia was for sure fueled by highly stressful real-world events. I mean, get this. In 1968, the IRS confiscated his car after a war tax protest. But things really peaked in November 1971, when his home was mysteriously broken into and his safe was literally blown open with explosives. Dick personally suspected this was a targeted military or CIA action against him, which prompted him to temporarily flee to Canada in '72. In Dick's fictional worlds, these paranoid delusions are horrifyingly real. When his characters feel like they're being watched or wired into, well, they usually are. This forces his heroes to navigate realities where the standard rules of humanity just no longer apply, which kind of makes their paranoia a completely rational response to a totally insane world. Section 5. Autism and Society's Patterns. The fourth condition Dick highlighted, particularly in Martian Timeslip, is autism. Within his novels, he explored the diagnosis not just as a clinical reality, but as this fascinating lens to view a society that is obsessed with embalming its own values. He essentially used the condition to question what is actually normal when society itself seems so deeply flawed. So here's the crucial contrast he drew. On one side, you have genuine biological life, which creates its own inherent, unique values. And on the other side, you have a neurotic society that basically demands rigid conformity to established social norms, rules that are passed down from parents and teachers at all costs. This quote brilliantly illustrates Dick's suggestion that the rigid, robotic public school systems on his fictional Mars were the true neurotics. The institution was attempting to eliminate any individual variation whatsoever. And by doing that, it made the quote-unquote normal society look far more deeply disturbed than the autistic individuals it was trying to pathologize. And finally, Part 6, Confronting Reality and Treatment. So, how did Dick and his beloved characters actually confront these overwhelming realities? Well, imparting his observations of actual treatment facilities of the time, Dick drew heavily upon his own real-life experiences at Synanon. This was a facility that shockingly morphed from a drug rehab center that pioneered aggressive attack therapy into a highly dangerous, violent cult by the 1970s before finally disbanding amid criminal convictions in 1991. Witnessing this crazy evolution firsthand deeply informed his profound skepticism of institutional solutions and factory-like psychiatric wards. In his novel, Now Wait for Last Year, a character discusses the agonizing choice of whether to abandon a hopelessly ill spouse. He ultimately concludes that doing so would be a rejection of reality itself. So, we'll leave you with this provocative dialogue. Think about your own life. When faced with the immense, sometimes chaotic complexities of the human mind, do you face reality exactly as it is, or are you too simply seeking easier rules to live by?